Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today. We hope that you enjoyed those songs, that music, and as we said in that first page, thank you to all the sponsors. Welcome to our annual Jose Gomez Farmworker Justice Day. My name is Maria Isabel Morales. I use she, her pronouns. I am a faculty member here at the Evergreen State College, and I am honored to co-facilitate today's in this year's panel. I'd like to begin first with an acknowledgement and an honoring of the traditional custodians of these lands, the indigenous people of the Squaxin Island, the Nisqually Indian tribe, and the Puyallup tribe of Indians. We will start by paying respect to the elders of the past and the present, to the children of the past and the present, to all the generations that have worked and continue to work to revitalize cultural values, traditions, and language. We acknowledge in order to contribute to greater public consciousness of native sovereignty and cultural rights. I will now pass on to my colleague, Ellen Short-Sanchez, who will give a brief history of Jose Gomez Farmworker Justice Day.
Greetings, I'm Ellen Short-Sanchez. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director of the Center for Community-Based Learning and Action at Evergreen, and we're a public service center, and our center has been committed to long-term campus community partnerships, and I'm here to share the long history of our annual Farmworker Justice event, and it's named after our dear colleague, Jose Gomez, who was a scholar and a farm worker and passed away too soon in 2014 after a battle with cancer. As an Evergreen undergrad in the 1980s, I was a work study student with the Labor Education and Research Center at Evergreen and was invited into solidarity work with Washington Farmworkers movement. And I was really impacted by the work of Rosalinda Guillen, the founder of Community to Community. And Farmworkers marched between Burlington and Mount Vernon, Washington, the area where farm workers right now are caring for and harvesting tulips this time of year. And I brought along the shirt, the memorial shirt, to talk about that event and to remember together. And thanks to the work, the hard work in the fields and in the movement, we now have a history of seeing how boycotts and solidarity work. And the Labor Center created this very event, our annual event during National Farmworker Awareness Week. And these discussions and presentations are really important because they are driven by and informed by current farm worker movements in Washington State. And it's an honor to witness how organizations work together, advocate, and determine collective action. This is a historical moment in the moment for struggling for workers' justice. And this event brings those closest to the work in the fields to share directly with us. This year's focus on farm workers are essential is the message of the movement. And I'm so glad and so grateful to the incredible organizations here today to share their groundbreaking work for justice. And we will hear the engagement and the emergent voices and long-term organizers. I really want to thank the students, Maddie Parvankin and Grace McClarty, who created the amazing website, and we'll put that link in the chat. And one of the pieces of that website are past historical videos of this event and farm worker work to help yourself catch up and learn from the past and carry on for the future. Thanks again to the sponsors that Maria Isabel mentioned and the amazing planning team. And now I'll pass it back to our wonderful facilitator. Thank you, Maria Isabel.
Thank you, Ellen, for giving us that brief but sweet story of how we have had this event here in our community. I want to emphasize that we have a WordPress site that will appear in the chat that I really invite for folks to go in and read a little more of the history of this event. And also in this WordPress site, you will find more to the story of the organizations we'll hear from today. As Ellen said, our panel entitled of this year is Essential Workers Organizing in a Pandemic. We will hear from panelists representing three very important organizations in our community, Community to Community, C2C, Familias Unidas por la Justicia, and Trabajadores Unidos por la Justicia, Families United for Justice and Workers United for Justice, who will talk about what happens to workers who are already exploited, who live in communities that are underrepresented and impacted disproportionately. Will get us to understand and rethink what it means to be an essential worker. Some of the panelists will speak in Spanish, and I will do my best to provide translation. It is possible that English speakers may not get 100% of what is said, and I would invite you to engage in dialogue with others who are also attending this event that might hold that linguistic capital to help you fill the gaps. I also want to invite you to sit with that moment of what it feels like to miss out when something is spoken in a language other than English, for this is an experience very familiar to a lot of us, to a lot of our families, and myself included. In my family, we continue to speak Spanish, and that is my home language and my first language, so I completely understand. After we hear from our panelists and time allows, we will close with a Q&A. So I invite all attendees to jot down questions that emerge as you are listening to the stories and to the comments and experiences that will be shared today, so that at the end, my colleague Pritalal will facilitate a Q&A session. Okay. Again, please refer to the WordPress site where you find more details about the organizations and more detailed biographies, both in English and Spanish. Okay. There is also English live captions for access support. Okay. We will move on to our panel. I want to just briefly name and introduce the panelists, and then I will pass the mic on so that we can hear from all the work that they've been doing. And so first we'll hear from promotoras from C2C, Community to Community, Arely Dominguez, who works alongside C2C, the C2C team, to continue the fight against injustice in our communities and around the world. We'll hear from Lucy Madrigal. Lucy is the promotoras coordinator at C2C, bilingual Chicana, born and raised in Skagit County. We'll also hear from Familias Unidas por la Justicia. We'll hear from Edgar Franks, who is the political director for the Independent Union of Farmworkers, Familias Unidas por la Justicia. And we'll also hear from Marciano Sanchez, a union organizer for FUJ. And in our last, but certainly not least, we'll hear from Trabajadores Unidos por la Justicia. We'll hear from Angie Lara, the Vice President of Trabajadores Unidos por la Justicia, and Maribel Medina, the Treasurer, Workers United for Justice, and also a proud worker in the fields and packing houses. Okay, so I'd like to now pass the mic to the promotoras of C2C, who will talk to us of farm worker-led and women of color-led environmental justice movements, and just give us an update of all the work they have done as of March 2020. So I'll pass the mic on for them to continue to introduce themselves and give us some palabras, some words to our students, faculty, and staff that are here joining us in this event. Thank you so much to C2C for being here.
Hi everyone, my name is Arely.
Hi everybody, my name is Lucy Madrigal.
And before we start, we also want to introduce the third promotora coordinator in Welcome, Australia. Australia, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Australia Tobon, Welcome County Promotora Coordinator.
There we go. Yeah, so as Maria had mentioned, promotoras have been involved in doing apoyo, solidaridad y servicio to our community, especially during these hard times during the pandemic. Some of the projects we've been involved with have been being in solidarity with all of our community members. And by being in solidarity with them, we have been handing out hand sanitizers, masks, face shields, infographics, having pláticas with our community members here in our office. And we've also been doing pláticas at our barrios, our neighborhoods, and going into the work field of some of our farm workers.
Yeah, and we've also been involved in projects where right now we are focusing with vaccines here in Skagit and Whatcom, where we have been able to vaccine over 1,000 people and counting, because we still want to continue that work. And we also helped with WIRF, Washington Immigrant Relief Funding, right? And we were able to help over 700 families throughout Washington State. And also we have been working with rental assistance here in Skagit and Whatcom. We've also had a COVID-19 testing site here in Skagit where we were able to stay till 9 p.m. Making sure that farm workers were getting tested for COVID if they felt any symptoms whatsoever. ¿Qué más? Australia? You want to talk a little
Also
bit?
to in relation to like our focus of apoyo, solidaridad y servicio, support, solidarity, and service, that also extends to a lot of like civic engagement, voter registration, signing up eligible voters, like going into our communities, conducting meetings with folks in Whatcom and Skagit about the census, and making sure everyone is counted, and encouraging participation and understanding what does it mean to be involved in the census politically, and also how can we make those changes possible. From that, we also engaged a lot of our farm worker communities to be a part of a process of environmental justice, which is equally important in the farm worker movement, that there is a need to connect what is being done to Mother Earth and the workers who work that land. So having farm workers speak truth to power about their experiences with their environment and what are those environmental hazards that are impacting, labor practices at work, retaliation, occupational hazards, lack of PPE, lack of supports for the health and safety of workers in the workplace. That also morphed to a lot of work into a COVID-19 farm worker study, where we interview collectively as a state with other community-based organizations, other promotoras in other rural parts of Washington, to have farm workers discuss and talk about their lived experiences through this pandemic and what's going on in their workplaces. So that's equally important too, that there is a lot of community surveys being done. There's a lot of data that the promotoras are collecting, right? Testimonies and those lived experiences to push policy. So there's the direct on the ground service, because our community is so disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. It was even more so before, but with the pandemic and all its challenges, we just want our people to survive. And that also extends to what my compañeras Lucy Areli talked about, is vaccines, vaccine equity, testing, medical care. There isn't a day that goes by where we get a lot of workers getting bad information about where they can go get tested. Are they being charged? Will I be treated with respect when I go into a clinic site? How do I get a vaccine? What are my rights to get the best vaccine available? I want the best for the work that I'm doing. So that's just a snapshot of work, but feel free to jump in, Areli, Lucy.
Yeah, I want to talk about a little bit of how hard it kind of has been for vaccine sites here in Skagit. We know that a lot of our farm workers salen tarde, they get out of work late. So we have been pushing to give vaccine sites all the way till as possible 9 o'clock. And it just seems to be a struggle, because the vaccines that were happening were from 11 to 4 p.m. And those hours were just not acceptable in our community. We had people like, I can't get off of work to go get vaccinated. And I think right now, like, it's just pushing to get those vaccine sites open for later, to have people come in later in the day to have vaccines. So that has just been a really struggle in Skagit to happen.
Yeah, also something that even though we, at the beginning of the pandemic, or at the beginning when they were administrating the vaccines, the times were not accessible to farm workers, we pushed for the local Department of Health to start adding times in the evening and the weekends, which eventually we did get, and CGC is currently working on creating a partnership with our local Department of Health to bring vaccine sites and vaccine mobile clinics more accessible to our farm worker community. And it has been working. It's slowly rolling up to where it's more accessible. But another barrier that we have is language. A lot of our farm worker community up here in Skagit is Indigenous, and their first language is not Spanish. It's either the most common ones are Mixteco and Triqui, and the promotoras have been at some of the mobile sites, and we've noticed that there's not enough translators in their Indigenous language. So even having Spanish speaking translator is not enough, because that's not the first language of our farm worker community here. So that's another barrier we've been experiencing. And Michelle, you want to talk about Whatcom?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for pointing that out about like the diversity of our community. I definitely know that we have the same populations up here in Whatcom because like agriculture is so fluid, folks go where the work is, right? And live and have like those like shared languages. But I know in Whatcom we have an increase of Central American communities with Spanish being the second language. We have our Quiche, Canjobal, Mom, Aguacateco, Chalchiteco communities, and they were the first farm workers wanting to get vaccines. All it took was one of their community members to get vaccinated, and they were there. And it's the success of our community and the trust that we have with our farm workers in different parts of the county, and all our promotoras making those connections that come in our part of those communities. So that definitely helped with vaccine hesitation and things like that. But I think the most important part was to push for equity for a low barrier option for vaccines. The community partners here in Whatcom, Peace Health, and North Sound Accountable Community of Health understood that they can't do this work alone. They can get all the shots they want, but people are not going to come if they don't feel that they're getting reliable, trusted information. And that's the thing we have to push with equity, especially for our farm workers, is that you can make an appointment easy. That's not a no-brainer, but the trust that needs to be involved is super important. So that's the instrumental piece of the promotoras, is to do the education. Farm workers have the right to know all the info before they make an informed decision for themselves and the family. So that's one thing that we saw in Whatcom and with our communities. Now we're hitting other forms of farm workers in the food chain. So we have processing workers who are in fisheries. We're having a big bloat of our nursery workers. The first major industry vaccinated was dairy workers. They wanted to be vaccinated stat, and they were getting quite a bit of outbreaks in our county. So we know simultaneously as we're getting vaccinations done, people need to get continuous testing, be informed of that even after they've been vaccinated, and also know that what's going on their work site. We equally need to know what's going on their work site when people tell us, hey, I work in this place, and they're still not following protocols. They're not giving us PPE, or I got fired because I didn't bring a mask to work. I'm like, what the heck? We're now in April and you're still dealing with this? What's going on? So I know in Skagit and our collective communities, there's still issues. So again, the vaccines are another way of revealing all these different types of forms of the food chain of our farm workers and what's going on in their work sites.
Yeah, and it continues to reveal the racist systems that we're living in. We have had also for like rental assistance, that's another project that we're working on, and we started working on last year. The first problems that we had with that was that the solidarity money that was going out to community members wasn't directly to them. It first had to go through all of these processes, get approved, go through the renter instead of to the person. Some of the renters did not want to accept the money because it would interfere with their taxes. They didn't want to show documents. And it just kept leading to community members being dislocated from their homes because they didn't have enough to pay. And even though we had the protection of folks shouldn't be being kicked out during the pandemic, it still continued to happen because of those racist structures and systems that we have in place.
Thank you. Thank you, Australia and Areli and Lucy for sharing, and C2C for giving us an update and giving us such a model, I think, for what can look like when communities organize, particularly around vaccines and COVID. And I know there's some questions that I'm thinking of, but I really would like to pass down to FUJ, and then maybe after FUJ and Trabajadores Unidos por la Justicia, that we can ask some questions before starting with our Q&A. Okay, so I will pass the mic to Edgar and Marciano with the Familias Unidas por la Justicia. If you could give us an update on the growth of the union, new staff, any intersections, connections with the work that C2C and what they just shared, or TUJ, any update on current farm worker issues they're seen and heard in the fields, orchards, and around. Thank you, Edgar and Marciano.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Edgar, the political director for Familias Unidas por la Justicia. Marciano actually had to step out a little bit. He's helping some members with some assistance they needed. So hopefully he'll come back in a little bit. So I think this last year has been very, I think very important in farm worker organizing. Not only that, but like immigrant organizing and communities that have been marginalized, that have traditionally been marginalized and held powerless. I think this last year really, really pointed out to why we need more unions and more community organization to collectively build power and really, provide the mutual aid that's needed, especially in the early days of the pandemic when it was announced, when there was a lot of uncertainties happening. There was a big fear about whether or not, people were going to get food or, help getting their rent paid, what was going to happen at work. And I think quickly we realized that how farm workers, workers that were considered essential, like the people in the processing plants and the grocery stores, a lot of the food workers, even some restaurants, they were just thrown out there to fend for themselves. At the same time being deemed essential for the first time ever. But yet, no changes, no benefits, special benefits or anything came with that title. So there was a kind of a contradiction within that. I think it was just something that, people in power threw out there to make themselves feel better about themselves or, justify sacrificing a whole part of an industry to keep things as normal as possible, even though normal was never good for farm workers and for people in the food system. I think early on, we heard about the need for personal protective equipment that never came to farm workers. Farm workers were, pretty much during this time, it was, tulips, the tulip fields. So here in Skagit, people were out there working with no personal protective equipment, not even a mask was, given out. If there was any mask, it was being given out by the promotoras or our union or other workers. They were sharing. The hand sanitizers and all that was all coming from community, not from employers or from state agencies. The oversight and enforcement of the new emergency rules, the 6 feet distancing, all the, like, if you stayed home, like all the support you were supposed to get, that never was seen or really enforced. So a lot of people, even if they did have symptoms, would rather go to work because they know if they missed a couple days, that could have mean that they would be homeless the next week. So these were like the realities that we were living in, a lot of these uncertainties. But, I think because of organizing constantly for now almost 7 years, Familias Unidas has built up an integrity in our community. So, we were in the position to really put pressure on elected officials, on labor and industries, Department of Health, to really start, looking out for the workers, and again, calling into question, what does it mean to be an essential worker? So I think we definitely did see the need of why unions are important, even though like an independent union like ourselves, which is, compared to like the SCIU or UFCW, where we're tiny, we're around 500 workers, but yet we represent a community that has been voiceless for many generations. But within that time frame, I think we've been able to create some of the most important changes for farm workers, not only in Washington, but, set a model and example for workers all over the nation. We were able to establish housing rules, emergency housing rules, especially for H2A workers, where some of the biggest outbreaks were happening, with a lot of resistance from employers, even though they always call us that we're their family and, we care for our workers, but yet making little changes to their housing, the way it's structured, became a political fight. And we had to really, force labor and industries and Department of Health to really held up their end of the bargain. And also asking them to be accountable, and the governor as well, and all his staff, for making all these declarations, but with no follow through, that they were putting people's lives at risk. So we were able to also, get finally personal protective equipment after a couple of months already of protesting and going through all the routes that we had to go to. It wasn't enough, but I mean, we started getting something. And, one of the biggest things that happened was that we got called in Yakima in May to go support workers that were out on strike and that they were in processing plants. And that was a real eye-opener, I think, because Yakima is the hub of all agriculture in Washington State. It's one of the big centers of political power as well, with all the growers and all the industry and the power hold that they have there. So we were able to go and, be side by side with hundreds and hundreds of workers that went out on strike within a couple of weeks. There was like 6 or 7 warehouses that were on strike. And we were there basically to witness and also share our experience and our support with all the workers from these warehouses, even though we were a farm worker union. But yet, because there is so few organizations that organize workers and try to build power in that way, I think that's why we were reached out, and also because we had been successful for a couple for years. I think that's one reason that I think, and because we had the trust of the workers and have seen trajectory of standing in solidarity. Again, we're not a processing warehouse union. We're farm workers, but yet it's our same community and our same people that are out there working in the processing and in the fields. So um, it was powerful to see these hundreds of workers going out on strike and standing up to their bosses, and also to, again, call attention to Labor and Industries Department of Health, who, in our mind, was always standing on the side of the industry. It was, there was really no enforcement, no nothing. That's why you saw thousands and thousands of workers getting sick, because since the pandemic, nothing really changed. There was just, business as usual for these processing houses. And we saw it in the fields as well. So there was a lot of intersections there. Um, um, but I think that really opened up the possibility of future organizing, and a whole new narrative, and a whole new way of people when they talk about workers, and the power that we have. I think people physically saw, just by seeing all the picket lines and the strikes that were happening, about how powerful workers are when they're organized, and losing that fear, and working as a collective, and then people from all around the state jumping on board and spreading the message. And because it was needed, and again, it wasn't happening in a vacuum. At the same time, the Black Lives Matter protests were happening all around the country. So, it was this whole environment of pointing out to unjust systems. And we were pointing out the unjust system that exists within labor and has always existed within labor. And the only way to change that is by going on strike and protesting and trying to change it, from workers themselves changing the system that has been built up to intentionally keep them in poverty and oppressed. So I think being with the workers in Yakima, in the Valley, really opened up our eyes here. It was one of the first times like this that there was a Western Washington and Eastern Washington kind of relationship that was being built intentionally, representing immigrants and people of color and working people, farm workers and processing plant workers working in solidarity. I think that was really powerful. And along the way, I think it built up so much. There was so much noise being made that they couldn't ignore anymore the voice of the workers. And I think that has been building so much momentum that we've been able to win really important cases legally. If there's if people measure winning by legal wins or legislation and stuff like that, I think we've been able to establish that already. So, we were able to win the housing rules. We were able to pressure more resources to Yakima Valley and to farm workers, and really look at how LNI and Department of Health run their departments. And at the same time, we were able to call to attention the plight of H-2A workers that were pretty much left on their own. In the wildfires and everything, we got lots of calls from H-2A workers that were still out working next to the fires in Brewster and in the Wenatchee Valley. And some of the big ones that just recently came along, because of all this momentum that has been built, was that we were able to win a case with Columbia Legal Services and our lawyer, Kathy Bernard, a federal case against the Department of Labor about the industry trying to lower the adverse wage effect rate, which establishes a rate for all farm workers. And this was done because of a faulty survey that was done through the Washington Farm Labor Association, WAFLA, the biggest labor contractor in the state. So we were able to win a Department of Labor case. The judge ruled in the favor of the workers. And one of the biggest ones that more recently came, it might be even signed this week, that we were able to win overtime for farm workers for the first time in over 80 years since the Fair Labor Standards Act and National Labor Relations Board. Washington now has overtime for farm workers being implemented next year. So with a phase in, which is not ideal, but we got something for farm workers, a big win, something that's historic. So, all these things, the ground campaign, being in solidarity with workers, standing up to the corporations and the bosses, lead to these they build a movement and momentum to really transform a system. And little by little, I think we're building more and more power where we can start changing the system more into our favor. We believe in the just transition framework, where we take an exploitative, extractive economy and transform it into one that's regenerative and ecologically, in tune with our ecosystems. So, I think that's where the union is positioned to. I think looking into the future, knowing that a lot of the agencies that are supposed to look out for workers and politicians and the industry is definitely not going to look into protecting workers. But now, really looking and envisioning what a just food system looks like. Unions is part of that, but then also envisioning what would it look like if we can transform the economy that's run by workers. So, I think I'll leave it at that, because I know the work that Trabajadores Unidos, it's really impactful and important. And I think it's important to hear from them and their struggle, because they have been a big piece about all this momentum that has benefited workers throughout Washington state. And, they've gotten attention, international attention, because of the way that they organized and, they continue to organize. So, it was good to meet Angie and Maribel, Agustin, Violeta, and all these people. And, seeing them and how they're growing. I think, from the beginning, it's been really impactful, and, the change that they're going to bring to the state is going to be beneficial to not only processing workers and Yakima, but to farm workers all over Washington as well. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Muchas gracias, Edgar. And I will now pass the mic to Angie and Maribel with Trabajadores Unidos por la Justicia, Workers United for Justice. If you two could give us an update, unionizing efforts, struggles, retos en su esfuerzo para organizarse como sindicato.
Hello, everybody. My name is Angelina Lara, and I am with the Vice President of Trabajadores Unidos por la Justicia. When we first started, I got to go back to when the pandemic hit us. I think everybody was new to any type of pandemic. We never really got something this hard anywhere. So I think it was something new for us and the company, and I think everywhere. We never thought we would be this exposed or this threatened ever. At least I wasn't ready for that. So when on the week of April, the last week of April of 2020, we were hearing about people getting sick, but of course we didn't know who it was because the company kept it a secret. They try to avoid saying who it was, saying that it was something that they had needed to keep, I guess, for privacy issues. At the time, we had a couple of people that got sick, and we just heard word of it. So Blanca Olivares comes up to me and says, I don't like how it's going. I believe that we need to let them know that we need protective equipment, that they need to take this more serious, that we need essential pay, hazard pay, what they were calling it at the time. And she was trying to negotiate that for us. And when we saw no response from the company, she said, well, we're going to try to, let's see what happens. And then we'll just walk out and see if they take that, a little more serious. This was the last week of April. I'm sorry. On April 30th, I got sick. I contracted COVID, went home sick that day. I was sick for a good 4 days. When I heard, I got a phone call from one of my coworkers stating that they had walked out for on strike to come and join them. At the time, like I said, this was new for everybody, so instructions were different than they are now. They didn't really tell you to go home and stay there for 2 weeks to keep everybody safe and from contracting COVID. So I guess at the time that I went to the lab, they just told me in 3 days, if you don't have a fever, you can go back to work. You're no longer a risk. So I took my note to work, and they expected me to go back to work right away. But I still wasn't feeling well, so I let them know I wasn't feeling well yet. The following day, I joined my coworkers on strike. Before this, I gotta let it be known that we did ask for protective equipment. We did ask for masks, and when we did ask for masks, we were told that we could bring our own. We can supply our own mask if we felt threatened by the COVID. We can provide ourselves with our own mask to bring. It wasn't something that it was required at work at the time. So everybody that brought mask, other people would just look at them like, oh, she's overreacting at the time. So we weren't provided with no safety equipment, no protection whatsoever, no 6 feet distancing. Everybody was, especially in a warehouse, it's so hard to be 6 feet apart. In the fast pace that we work in, it's so hard to be 6 feet apart. It's never been something that they've been able to provide us with. No matter what they do, that's just something that they cannot provide us with. This type of work really can be 6 feet apart. They have put like protective equipment in between us and giving us face masks and face shields and supply us with, spray bottles that supposed to have some type of clean solution and rags to clean our machines as we supposedly go to work. But before this, none of that was happening. None of that. We had, if somebody was to go home because they were sick, right away they would put the other person to go work in the same line the person that got sick left from. So at this time when we walked out, I want to say that when we walked out, the company took it a little more serious and started providing people with something here, something there. Not everything that they do right now is something that they did before. I remember at one point I asked one of the leads if I could have a face mask because the shield was interfering with my breathing. I had, after COVID, I stayed with, my asthma was a little more altered. So I couldn't wear the face shield. It was giving me an anxiety because I couldn't breathe. I felt like, I don't know, I just felt like I was in a cube. And I let her know if I can have another type of face mask protection. And she said, if you want it, you can bring your own. We're not providing that for, this is what we're providing, and this is what people need to work with. and we're not going to make an exception for you. So at this time, we had, we didn't have, it was in the summer already, and we had literally no air conditioning. If they call the big fans they put, which it was for 42 lines, 4 fans that did not move around. You were lucky if you would stand in front of the air. That's the as much oxygen that you would get. I remember a lot of people complaining about their breathing, complaining about headaches, complaining about fever, but they wouldn't be sent home. They would still stay working because they needed to get the job done. And it was something that I kept thinking about. So many people that were literally sick working, and they stayed working sick because some of these people have no health insurance or have no way of getting paid for the 2 weeks that they would be staying home due to COVID. So it was either go home and not get paid or stay there and stuck it out. So if I can say that us walking out made a big change, in some ways, a lot of the things that they're doing right now are thanks to us walking out, are thanks to us bringing that to the light, to exposing them. What else can I say? I wrote a lot of stuff down because I was like, you know, so little time, so much to say, but I'm pretty sure that my other co-workers will do great at this. When it comes to concerns about the changes that we wanted to make, there's still a lot of changes that we need to make in the company. Exploitation is number one. The way they work people, they work us as if we were machines, not people. So COVID is one of the things, but this exploitation has been going on for so many years. This is not the only, I think COVID is the one that just pushed us to the edge to do something about it. I think it was the last thing that made us say it's now or never. We either try to make a change now or we're never going to get this opportunity again. So for me to say that thanks to COVID, there's been many changes. I'm glad that that's going on, and I'm just looking forward to the many more changes that we're going to be able to make throughout the warehouses and the community.
Buenas tardes,
Good afternoon.
mi nombre es Maribel Medina.
My name is
Soy parte de Trabajadores Unidos por la Justicia.
Maribel Medina. I am part of Workers United for Justice.
Voy a platicar un poco de lo que mi compañera habló. Muchas de las acciones que la compañía tomó para proteger a la gente fue después de que nosotros se las hicimos ver, se las hicimos notar que eran cosas que tenían que hacer.
I'm going to talk a little bit about what my compañera spoke to. Many of the issues that the company saw is because we forced them to see those issues.
Y el día que salimos a huelga, desgraciadamente, perdimos compañeros. Después de que salimos a huelga, un compañero de nosotros muy cercano falleció debido al COVID.
The day we went on strike, unfortunately, as was just said, we lost a comrade. We lost that comrade connected to COVID.
Salir a huelga fue algo muy difícil porque muchos de nosotros, o la mayoría, puedo decir que nunca había pasado algo así.
To go on strike was really hard because for many of us, you know, we had never experienced something like this.
Tuvimos muchos obstáculos, tanto el clima, la temperatura, obstáculos que la compañía nos estaba poniendo día tras día.
We had many challenges, many obstacles, such as climate, weather, and just other challenges the company were creating for us.
Sufrimos de amenazas de muerte incluso, pero orgullosamente puedo decir, ¿verdad? Fuimos la primera compañía en el Valle que salió a huelga y después nos siguieron 6 más.
We suffered threats, death threats, unfortunately, but we were the first company that went on strike in our community.
Y creo que fue el primer paso que dimos hacia el cambio. Creo que esto es algo bueno porque nos dimos cuenta que, como dijo mi compañera, gracias a COVID, esto fue la gota que derramó el vaso. Podemos parar muchas.
This was the first step towards change. And as my compañera said, right, this was really the final drop.
Y pues gracias a esto estamos aquí, formamos una unión independiente, estamos estamos organizando, estamos aprendiendo porque no sabíamos hacerlo, lo estamos haciendo gracias a ayudas de comunidad a comunidad, familias unidas. Ellos han estado aquí desde el primer día apoyándonos. Entonces, creo que lo que estamos haciendo es algo que va a cambiar la historia de la gente campesina en el Valle de Yakima.
Thanks to this, we are here. Right? We are an independent union. We are learning every day how to organize with the help of C2C and FUJ. They have been here for us, and so we hope that this is a start to a change for Farmworker Justice.
Estuvimos 24 días en huelga. En estos 24 días hicimos hasta una huelga de hambre. Yo fui parte de ella. Yo pasé 48 horas sin comer. Mi pareja pasó 53 horas sin comer, esperando que la compañía negociara.
We were 24 days. We went 24 days on strike. Also, we went on a hunger strike. I was one of those folks that went on a hunger strike. I spent 48 hours without eating, and my partner went 53 hours without eating.
Pero desgraciadamente, debido a esto, no escuchamos nada de la compañía que quisiera negociar algo con nosotros. Tuvimos que ir a Olimpia, entonces fue cuando decidieron salir a platicar con nosotros. Se lograron algunas cosas, no todas las que queríamos.
Sadly, we didn't hear from the company even after the strikes. We had to go to Olympia, and some changes came about, but not everything that we hoped for.
Pero creo que dimos un pequeño paso hacia el cambio. Seguimos organizando, como dije antes, fuimos a una elección, desgraciadamente la perdimos, la compañía puso obviamente su dinero, su poder para influenciar a los trabajadores a no votar a favor de la unión, pero pues no nos rendimos, seguimos aquí, creemos que estamos haciendo algo bueno para la comunidad y queremos ver el cambio. Si no es en la compañía Alan Brothers, pues tal vez puede ser en otra, eso esperamos.
We believe that this is a small step towards change. We are organizing. We did have an election that we sadly lost. The company used their power and their money to sway people, and we lost that election, but we don't quit. We're not giving up. And we do believe that we are doing something great for change.
Sí, sabemos que no estamos peleando con alguien insignificante, son compañías que tienen bastante dinero, poder, y lo usan para seguir explotando trabajadores. Ahí tenemos compañeros y conozco mucha gente que trabaja en bodegas por más de 20 años que sigue ganando el mínimo. Creo que debe de cambiar y es el tiempo de que cambie.
We know we are not fighting something small. These are companies with a lot of money, with a lot of power, that use that money and power to continue to exploit the worker. But we don't give up, and we'll keep fighting forward.
Y pues muchas gracias por invitarnos.
And so thank you very much for inviting us. Muchas gracias, Maribel, por compartir. Thank you, Angie. Thank you to TUJ for sharing. I know that there are questions in the Q&A, and I just want to say that we will get to those questions. So just bear with us when we get to a Q&A session. I want to say to what you just said, Angie, I really appreciate, and Maribel, your personal experiences and, bringing light to what it has been for trabajadoras, workers in warehouses, right, during COVID, and what it means to, have protective gear, right? Some of the stories you shared about feeling anxiety, I have relatives and women in my family, my mom, who knows that same, who has experienced the same thing of feeling anxiety with all the layers of, and it is impossible to stay 6 feet apart. So I really appreciate that personal perspective. One question for anybody who'd like to address folks, promotoras, C2C, FUJ, or TUJ, is why and how have women become such strong leaders in this fight? If you can talk a little bit about your perspectives from the organizations you represent, the role of women in this fight to organize, particularly during this pandemic. If anybody would like to answer that question. Perhaps someone C2C would like to take it on.
Oh, there you are.
Australia. Thank you, Australia. Would you like to address that question?
Yeah. I think the promotoras would like to answer that question. I think that women leadership is so important. I mean, C2C believes in ecofeminism, right? Mother Earth has feminine characteristics, and the way we treat our land is a reflection to like how we treat our the people on that land and who work that land. So I think that there's definitely a role of women in the movement, and showing the way, and also learning with our knowledge and our lived and personal experiences. And we all have things inherently in us that we can use to be active participants in doing change for our communities. I don't know, Arely, Lucy?
Yeah, I agree with what my compañera Australia said. And even so CGC Promotoras is a program through community to community. And we're all women of color and undocumented women. And we do have male folks that are volunteers or youth fellows, but the leadership is mostly women. Here in Skagit, the coordinators, we have about 9 promotoras, and they all come from different backgrounds. All of them share the same farm worker background. Some of them are undocumented, some of them are immigrants, some of them are mothers in their late 40s. Some of us are younger. We have a young promotora, she's 17, and she volunteers with us. So just that sharing each experience and knowledge, because of the variety and difference of age and culture, helps each other build more leadership. It encourages us, our older women, get the courage from the younger folks to speak out more, to feel more comfortable, making decisions and being out in the community. And our younger promotoras also learn from the older women of our cultura, our roots, our history, why some of our parents came to the US. And it's just a beautiful experience.
Well, my compañeras pretty much took everything, said it all really beautiful. And yeah, I just think it's a beautiful thing. I know that I'm going to talk about my experience. I think working in the field that I'm working in, I think it's me kind of showing my mom like the leader that she in a way couldn't be as growing up. So I feel like my mom has really great leadership skills. And so I feel like I'm doing that for her. And so it's really touching for me. And I'm like very grateful doing the work that I do. And I'm really grateful for working with alongside Australia and Areli.
Thank you so much for addressing that. Would Edgar or Angie or Maribel like to add to this question of just the role women have in this organizing in this work that you're all doing in the community?
Sí, para mí es un orgullo estar en esto. Es realmente un orgullo poder decirle a la familia, enseñarles a mis hijas que ellas sepan cómo defender sus derechos, enseñarle a la comunidad cómo defender sus derechos. Realmente para mí, creo que las mujeres podemos, las mujeres somos fuertes y somos demasiado fuertes como para enseñar y hacerlo.
For me,
Claro,
it's a source of pride to do this work, to show my family, to show my daughters that we can speak up and we should. That women can do it, right? And we are strong. We are too strong to let these forces defeat us. Gracias, Maribel. Anybody else? Edgar would like to respond, or Angie?
Yes, yo estoy con Maribel. Es un orgullo poder hacer esto, más porque soy mujer. Como lo han dicho ellos muchas veces, esto es una bonita enseñanza para la nuestra futura generación, ¿verdad? Queremos que ellos vean que nosotros hemos hecho el esfuerzo de que haya cambios para que ellos no tengan que pasar por lo que ha pasado ya uno. Así que sí es un orgullo estar haciendo esto como mujer, como madre, como, o sea, diré yo como amiga, porque tengo muchas personas que trabajan en las bodegas y mi familia misma, ¿verdad? Dice que qué bueno que estamos haciendo esto con la comunidad y que estamos haciendo esto para defender los derechos de tantas personas que se conforman con el maltrato del trabajo por no perder su trabajo y y pues que le da gusto que haya alguien que tenga la valentía de hablar por ellas y luchar por ellas.
Thank you, Angie.
Gracias.
Gracias, Angie. Angie says it is a source of pride, and it's a beautiful teaching to future generations, right? That we want them to see that we fought, to know that we fought hard, so that there could be changes, right? I'm proud to do this as a woman. I'm proud to do this as a mother, as a friend. And my family says that it's a good thing what we're doing, what we're organizing for all the many people that don't speak up, right? The many people that have in some ways accepted the exploitation, right? That this is possible and these changes are possible. Thank you. Okay. Maybe another question, and we will then go and take a 5-minute break for maybe stretch break, bio break for participants, and then we'll start a Q&A session. But because we're thinking and talking about COVID, and particularly the promotoras or C2C, y'all were talking about the organizing around vaccinations. I know in the community, I'm from the Wenatchee Valley, I have noticed kind of a disconnect between older generations and younger generations in terms of how they perceive vaccines. And what I've heard is that you all have been doing a lot of organizing to promote education around what that is, right? And that it's related around trust, that the community trusts y'all to and so therefore they take the vaccine. So I'm curious as to, have you seen, witnessed, just sort of that fear, right, a hesitation to be vaccinated in the community, and if so, is it kind of change across generations, or is that something that you're not witnessing in the communities that you work with?
Yes, we have seen hesitation from our older folks here in Skagit. We are getting the most resistance from Indigenous folks, and it's a valid reason. They tell us, like, I never got vaccinated in Mexico and I'm okay. Like, why should I get vaccinated now? And another thing that they bring up is the bad experiences they've had in medical related fields, like going to the doctor, stuff that happened to their grandparents that was like an example. One of the farm worker woman that we talked to was, she went into a procedure at a hospital and she ended up getting her, I don't know how to say in English, her matriz, se la quitaron, and she
Her
had
uterus?
her uterus, and she didn't consent of that. So that was a traumatizing experience for her. So she doesn't even go to the doctor to do regular checkups. So she's like, why should I trust him again? Like, how am I going to know that this is not going to further affect me? And even knowing like the history of how it's, the medical system is also racist, the structure and the practices. It's very complicated to have those conversations with our community members because their experiences are valid, and also trying to share knowledge of how the process of having an emergency vaccine works. It has taken us time, but like Australia mentioned earlier, that engaging with people and following up and continuing the pláticas has helped us be trusted enough to actually get them to get vaccinated, because we also don't want to like push people and demand them like, you need to get vaccinated. Like, that's not going to work. And we've seen that it doesn't work, because in other counties they've told us that folks have gone for their first vaccine but they don't return for their second one, and it's because of that distrust and no interaction follow-ups with community members, because it's kind of like a checklist. Like, that's how we always feel like, oh, we got the Latina community, we got the farmer community, check, but they never keep that interaction going.
And also for us, modeling that getting the vaccine was really important. When we pushed for us, so we could also be one of the, and was it the first phase?
Yeah,
The first phase to get
vaccinated,
the first tier to get vaccinated, so folks can see that we were getting vaccinated, and just have those pláticas of how we felt and what effects happened to us. And so us letting our community know that it was like really minor effects, they were considering, and okay, maybe I will take it, and just having those pláticas with our community.
Thank you for addressing that question. I'd like to invite if Angie or Maribel would like to speak to that, or Edgar.
Yeah, a lot of what the promotoras have said is what we've been hearing also. I think also, because of just how bad the reaction was from the Department of Health and all the state agencies that were supposed to be looking out for workers, how bad they were, that response, workers kind of lost trust in that whole process. But this is the process now that we have to go through to get the vaccines. So to build up that trust again, it's gonna take a while. I think it's taking a while. So trying to get the information out, combating misinformation, it's really hard. But I think that little by little, I think that more and more people are starting to recognize that they need the vaccine, for various reasons. Some are health, some others like, well, I can't travel, then I have to get the vaccine. There's like all these other factors are going into why people are getting the vaccine. So, Yeah, it's still kind of a work in progress of getting people to buy into the vaccination process. But community organizations and the unions, we have to. This is like one of our priorities to make sure that workers are safe. As well, not just vaccinating and living with COVID, but we also have to pressure in like how do we totally eliminate COVID. I think that's been kind of lost in the whole conversation, not just living with it and adapting to it, but how do we like prevent a future worse COVID. I think that's been something that we need to also talk about.
Sure. Thank you, Edgar. Thank you, promotoras. Angie, Maribel, I know that in your experiences, you're also, talk to us about, in addition to vaccines, there's all these other ways that COVID is much more complicated for los trabajadores dentro de los warehouses, right? So go ahead, Maribel.
Sí, la compañía donde nosotros trabajamos, Allen Brothers, están diciendo, bueno, es obligatorio, es mandatorio la vacuna para todos los trabajadores, pero sé de muchas compañías que ni siquiera están implementando los reglamentos de distanciamiento, las mascarillas, no están respetando nada de eso, mucho menos van a pedir que los trabajadores se vacunen. Nosotros tuvimos un evento el sábado de vacunación conjunto con otras organizaciones y el Departamento de Salud de Yakima. Casi 250 personas fueron vacunadas. Lo tristemente de esto es que muy pocos hispanos, muy poca gente hispana fue a vacunarse.
Okay.
Tuvimos conjunto a esto, tuvimos otro evento y le preguntábamos a la gente y muchos pues no quieren vacunarse, muchos porque tienen miedo a la vacuna por lo que se dice,
Sí.
otros porque dicen que no la necesitan, ya les dio COVID.
Sí.
Entonces,
Gracias,
es mala
Maribel.
información.
Mala información. Maribel says that in the company where I work, it is obligatory, Allen Brothers Company, to get a vaccination. But I do know of many other companies who are already not implementing social distancing and all of the other regulations. So they're really not going to bring in vaccinations. On Saturday, we did have a vaccination event. We had over 250 people show up, but sadly, very few Hispanics came. And it really has to do with fear. They are afraid and also misinformation around what the vaccine is. People think that, well, I already got COVID, so I don't need to get the vaccine. Gracias, Maribel. Okay. Unless anybody else wants to jump into that, if it's okay, we can take a 5-minute break. Promotores, panelists, is that okay? We can take a 5-minute break. You can do some stretching. So attendees, after a 5-minute break, we will start a Q&A session. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully folks got a break and are ready to start our Q&A. So my name's Preeta Ali, her pronouns. I'm a faculty member in food justice at Evergreen, and I want to thank the panelists again for this really rich and informative presentation and for sharing your time and energy with us. It's always a very inspiring connection and a longstanding connection that Evergreen has had with the farm worker communities, and we're very grateful to be able to support your work and to learn from you. So there are a number of questions in the Q&A. Let's see. So yeah, I think I could just read the question, and then as many of the panelists that would like to respond are welcome to. So one question is, how does intersectionality play into these social movements? Edgar mentioned Black Lives Matter. How does disability justice, feminist movements, et cetera, intersect with the fight for farmworker justice? And I think we did talk some about the feminist movement earlier. Perhaps we could also loop back in the environmental justice movement that the promotoras talked about earlier. So maybe speaking a little bit more about those connections too with farmworker justice. Be great. So maybe Edgar, or would you like to start us?
Well, yeah, I think that like I said, lots of things don't happen in just a vacuum and aren't just, of themselves. Think the trick is, how do you make the connections and link what's happening with one community to the other and kind of look for the similarities. And I think that what was happening last year in Yakima coincided for the fight for racial justice and calling out, the systems that are oppressing people. So, the same system that, killed George Floyd is the same system that's, putting farm workers and processing workers at risk, all in the name of preserving, the current power structure. So, I think that's the kind of the work, I think, of building a movement and finding where it connects to the larger justice movement as a whole. But it is a lot of work, because the fights are sometimes seen as disconnected or just about one issue. But if you can find a way to really link up the struggles and make people realize that it's it's all in kind of in the same context that all these is happening, I think it has the potential to changing lots of things. So yeah, I think that because of what was happening with the George Floyd protests all around the nation and what was happening with the workers in Yakima, and it was like all over the country, workers getting sick, dying, nobody doing anything, people getting killed by the police, nobody really doing anything, so people had to go out and protest. So it was happening, all over the United States, not just in Yakima or Washington. So and it's a very it's kind of an exciting time, because you saw the revival of a lot of social movements and people and young people getting more active, even with the pandemic looming in the background or very present. So yeah, that's kind of how I was seeing things from the movements.
I also like to answer that, if that's okay.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I definitely think that especially with like everything being so politicized and polarized, especially in times of the pandemic, and then also based on like the political moment, I think that too, that it's too easy to go into identity politics. And I say that because in what we know, right, with working with our farm worker community, right, when there was news about, the murder of George Floyd or the movement for Black Lives, there was conversations about, did the community watch the video? Did they understand what was going on? How's that linking to our local experience of what policing looks like? So it was really real to like see those connections here locally and within our promotoras, right? So how are we in solidarity with those movements? And like, how do we see intersectionality within our own farm worker spaces? So for instance, there was long conversations between what happened with George Floyd and the movement for Black Lives, with policing and immigration being a border state, like, and our proximity to the border and us being part of an agricultural system, right, that uses quasi slave labor types of conditions in the industry that profits many, but not the folks directly impacted. I think it hits really real, like when it's whatever someone in our organizing spaces, like the people that we serve or provide solidarity or want to fight up for their rights, for like the need for overtime, like there's linkages, right? We're not so different from this group of folks that may look different from us, may have very distinct experiences with said things related to like, who brought this up, Clara, talk about like disability justice, feminist movements. There's an intersectionality. For our women farm workers, they get that. They get that. They get that at home. They get that in their workspaces when they work with their kids. To those who get stopped by police frequently just because they're driving without a driver's license and they're subject to, being exposed to immigration and ICE. So us as promotoras, as, on the ground, organizing your communities, help to create those dialogues to start thinking about what cages or what situations we're in that make it really hard to like think about an alternative. I just wanted to point that out too. Too much so we start thinking in like identity politics that can be a divisive factor in like organizing. So.
Thank you. And then Lucy and did you want to add anything to that question?
No, I think we agree with what Edgar and Estrella say, and we want to give space to answer more questions.
Okay, great. Yeah, and then did you also want to speak to, so a lot of our students are studying, taking a climate justice seminar too right now. So it's like seeing those links between the farm worker struggles and climate change and climate justice. And I know that's been an issue in like previous years with forest fires and like with pesticide exposure, like environmental, like exposure to environmental toxins. And could you say a little bit more about like which I talked about earlier in terms of some of the like current environmental hazards, or like just some of those connections to like Mother Earth that you kind of center, or like that you connect into your work as well with the farm workers?
I think besides pesticides, something that's been coming up and it's starting to, community members are starting again to talk about is the summer and the heat and the forest fires. So last year we didn't have a lot of forest fires that were like affecting this area, but they're worried that, because they always tell us like every year it's harder because se está poniendo más caliente. Like it's getting hotter outside to work, and then we have to use masks to do the precautions for COVID. And sorry, I lost my train of thought. But yeah, they've been asking us about, so now that we're vaccinated, is it okay that we don't use like our mask outside? And like we're outside, so está abierto, the air is flowing. And I think that's what they're worried about right now, the heat and pesticides and disinfecting themselves. So before, when some of the workers were work with pesticides, they already knew, and it's what helped them kind of protect themselves during the pandemic of like, okay, when I get home, I know that I have to disinfect myself before going into the car. And then while I drive and I get home, like make sure that I don't hug my kids or I don't go through the common areas of the house. And a lot of them didn't have the option because they live in apartments. So there's only like one way to enter the house. But just continuing that education of like, lo que ya estaban haciendo, sigan haciendo during the pandemic and moving forward. But the root problem is they shouldn't be going through all of that, because we should stop the use of pesticide.
Yeah, about again, I think when we talk about the climate justice, I think for me and for us, what I think that means, it's a system change. And how do we create that system change? We have to build up the mass movements and but also present what are the alternatives to the current system. I think that's kind of been one of the places where we need to get better at presenting. And from our point of view is in agriculture and workers. So, that's kind of how we look at climate justice. So what things do we need to change from the labor and agricultural perspective to get us where we want in climate justice? So, obviously changing the rules, making it easier for workers to organize and make life better. And that in turn will create, more consciousness and, the momentum needed to really address the more kind of the systemic issues. I think in Washington State right now we have a big cap and trade bill that's on the table, which for us is very problematic because it's being framed as climate justice, but it's not, because it's still aiming to preserve the same system of polluters getting away with everything, only that they're paying and giving money back to supposed impacted communities, but it's not doing anything to stop the pollution or extraction of natural resources. That in turn, the heat, the pesticides, the everything affect workers on the ground. The real life consequences are being felt by workers on the ground, not only here in Washington, but all throughout the world, and causing migration. It becomes like this, what do you call that? A feedback loop. So, being aware of those, like we call false solutions, presenting what is the alternative, and in our mind is having workers control the means. So, having land, farming and growing organically, envisioning a whole new economic system with the values that we uphold. So I think those are kind of how we relate to climate justice from the point of view of our union.
Thank you. And yeah, Maribel, Angela, if you would like to jump in, we welcome to hear from you too. But we also have more questions.
Sí, como la mayoría de mi familia son trabajadores de campo, los pesticidas, como están diciendo, los pesticidas, el calor, todo afecta. Tengo parientes muy enfermos debido a los pesticidas que usan para la manzana. A los rancheros o a los dueños no les importa proteger a sus trabajadores, solamente protegen hasta las casas que están alrededor de los files, porque son casas de gente o de los mismos dueños o de gente con dinero, pero no les importa si está una persona trabajando y si pasa el tractor y lo llena de spray, no les importa.
Gracias,
Tengo
Maribel.
un tío debido a los pesticidas.
Maribel says that I have the heat, as was said, and pesticides, affect us. The majority of my family works in the fields and farms. I have relatives that are very sick from the exposure to pesticides in apple orchards. Ranchers and the owners of these orchards, they don't care about the workers and their health, right? They want to protect the houses, but they don't protect the workers. They don't care if there's a tractor going around spraying the trees with pesticides, and if there are people working there. And it's very much an important issue. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So, let's see, there's one question also about the unions. It's kind of like a commented question. Many unions working to support employee efforts to form a union in the face of the regressive labor laws in the US, in parentheses, the most pro-employer labor laws in the industrialized world, advocate stepping back after a certification election is lost. There is a belief the employer will find a way to do just enough to pacify any future efforts at unionization without making real change, as long as the union advocates continue to work for positive change. It sounds like all involved in this effort are continuing to advocate for positive change despite the failure to gain certification and recognition through an election. Can people speak about their perceptions of the relative merits or problems with continued advocacy versus stepping back until an election can be won? And this is interesting too, just in thinking about the intersectionality and like with the, there's like the big union drive that was in Bessemer, Alabama with the Amazon workers that they also lost because of similar like union busting tactics that the employer was using with the workers in Yakima. So just wondering too what you think about like that question, and then just maybe like any alternative like models besides sort of the more traditional sort of union route.
Sí, he sabido y he escuchado y he sido testigo que muchas veces las uniones, al perder la elección, se hacen a un lado. La diferencia con nosotros, trabajadores unidos por la justicia, es que nosotros trabajamos ahí y estamos viendo día a día las necesidades de los trabajadores. Nosotros no pensamos rendirnos, no queremos rendirnos. Para eso necesitamos mucho apoyo, necesitamos todavía la ayuda de la comunidad, porque no queremos ser como todas las uniones o muchas de las uniones, ¿verdad? Como mencionan, que pierden la elección y se hacen a un lado y dejan a los trabajadores a su suerte. Nosotros no queremos hacer eso.
Maribel says that, I have seen that there are times when unions lose elections, that they will like step aside and leave the workers. But that's not the way we work here at TUJ. And mostly because those that are involved with TUJ work in the factories and the warehouses. So we see on the daily the challenges of and the conditions of being in these places. We will not give up. We do need support and continue to need support from the community. But we at TUJ will continue to be and won't be like, as is often said, unions that just step aside and leave their workers.
Okay, gracias, Maribel. Edgar, do you want to answer that question too about the next?
I think that unions, there's a lot of things that unions do apart from getting contracts. I think a lot of people see that if you don't have a contract, then you're not a union. But I think, for us, we didn't have a contract for like 4 years of campaigning, but we still considered ourselves a union because we were a group of workers that were organizing for something. Ultimately it's just something the union does, administer a contract. But base building, community organizing, educating people on why we need changes. I think filling the void that's left out there for farm workers, that's where union steps in. I think redefining what a union is and does, I think that's really important. That's why we believe in independent unions, because we, like Maribel was saying, because we work at these places, we know how to make them better or safer for workers, and because we're going to be the ones that are like directly impacted. And it's up to the workers themselves at that place to address that. And if it's not them, it's going to be hard for somebody from the outside to try to do that themselves. So and I think that's kind of the thoughts on kind of rethink what a union is, especially now, and how do we come up with new strategies to build worker power.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, so there's also some questions about, it looks like some of the policy pieces. Maybe I can lump some of them together. So how are state representatives and senators responding to passing laws that affect farm workers, especially during this time of COVID? And how can we help support farm workers who live in different districts than us to get their state senators and representatives to support farm worker legislation? So maybe, if you're able to talk about any like current sort of policy campaigns. And then another question from a student: as a policy advocate, I'm wondering what can be, if anything, in terms of legislation, media, and building relationships with state reps to address the injustices being faced by farm workers.
I'll go. I'm talking a lot, but I think so. Just to really quickly, I think it's so hard for farm workers to access their representatives, even though we have some really good ones here in Skagit. But in general, like the Yakima representatives are really conservative and anti-worker. The Wenatchee Valley representatives are conservative and anti-worker. But so we need the people that say they're going to fight for us to really fight for us. I think there's been a lot of waffling, especially when it comes down to bills in Washington State Legislature and the Senate, to really get watered down to appease the industry instead of really fighting for what workers are asking for. And I think that's something that we saw this last session with our experience in the overtime bill. But but I think we just need bolder, more like, fighters, real fighters in our legislature, in our Senate. But again, that comes with it doesn't just happen by them doing it. It's it takes a movement of people to get them to that point. So that's just more work that we have to do as unions.
Thank you. Anybody else want to address that question about the current policy campaigns or initiatives with the legislature? Okay, maybe not. So let's see. Yeah, I think also.
Oh,
maybe just
sorry.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. Please. Thank you.
Is it okay? Sorry, that's my audio's a little off. Can I take the question to respond to that for the promotores? So the question was, how are state representatives and senators responding to passing laws that affect farm workers, especially during the time of COVID, right? And also, how can we support farm workers who live in different districts than us to get their state senators and representatives to support farm worker legislation? Okay. I will say that the COVID-19 farm worker study that I referenced, that could be found on COVID-19farmworkerstudy.org, I believe. I could also put it in the chat, was really insightful. We had other organizations, community-based organizations across the state doing the same work that we were doing here on the West Side to document what is going on with our farm workers, right? What is going on now in the midst of COVID, and how have our farm workers taken care of themselves despite workplace and lack of workplace protections and safety protocols, and emergency ruling from the state, right? That Edgar referenced. That is really powerful. Data collection from our own communities is super powerful when we talk to legislators about the need to make policy recommendations that are longstanding. I mean, the fact that this study was so instrumental for vaccine allocations is powerful in itself, right, to saving farm worker lives. But in the long term, we fought for bills that are related to climate justice. You'll see our name associated with the HEAL Act of this year, to push environmental justice policy. So we have representation at the table, and having farm workers represent themselves and the solutions needed, right? We saw that with the overtime bill and conversations around farm workers about, like, we are deserving of the same wages that other industries have, and especially for working 40 hours, right? There's a lot of that. And then also on a bigger scale nationally is a conversation about immigration and labor with the Farm Worker Modernization Act, right? A lot of farm workers are asking, hey, promotoras, is there anything new with immigration with this Biden administration, right? So I just think it's really big to know that data from communities is equally important when we're talking with state representatives that are from other districts. There's a lot of dissent and criticisms of the fact that we have our own data. Well, the growers industry have a lot of data. We have our own data too. And I think that's very impactful. And especially with our partners across the state, other promotoras, other community organizers, that saying no, there's a lived experience that's still being unaddressed, and the conditions need to be changed. And especially now, you owe it industry, you owe it government to pick up your end and make sure that there's actually protections in place. So the study that I'm referencing, again, the data collection is in coordination with Oregon and California. So we're not alone making up this data. This is a shared trend throughout the West Coast states, right, of our workers. So I think that's just really impactful. The data is very impactful. So that's how we're going to be talking the same language when we talk to representatives about, look, this is our data. It's valid and true. It's been collected. It's been vetted through an institution like University of Washington. What more do you want? I don't know. I get really bitter about representatives, but our promotoras, our job is to, informed community and where that's community data driven. And they also choose where they want to share this info and where the spaces that they don't want to. So, yeah.
Yeah, when you mentioned the Farm Worker Modernization Act, there is a question too about the H-2A visa workers, if they have access to healthcare and the housing program that you talked about earlier. Did you want to answer that, or did anybody else want to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, hey group, like jump in for sure. I don't want to be taking up a lot of space with like a lot of these responses, but I think, yeah, thank you for the audience member, the student who talked about H-2A. The employer is supposed to provide access to that and the documentation for their travel here and immigration status to work lawfully. So hold on, my copy's going away. What was the question again?
Okay, yeah, I think I moved it to the answer section. I can read it again. It's the H-2A visa worker, or yeah, H-2A visa workers to have access to healthcare and the housing program.
Yeah. So some of the H-2A workers here in Skagit, it's a low amount of folks that have H-2A visas. And like Australia said, the employer is supposed to be providing that housing. We did a study in 2018, I believe, with UW, and during that survey, we learned that a lot of the H-2A workers did not have medical health insurance. They didn't know where to go. The only time they actually left the farms was to get food. They couldn't have interactions with community members, like they couldn't go to the park or like do any other activities besides going out to get their groceries and to send money back to Mexico. And even at their workplace, they had really bad working conditions. I know some of the dairy workers talked about, he wasn't an H-2A worker actually, but I was thinking of the overtime bill of the dairy workers, how their conditions were bad, where they didn't have breaks. They would work 12, 15-hour shifts and se turneaban between the night and the morning. They didn't have breaks, and when they did, their living conditions were their working conditions where they ate was bad. Sometimes they had to eat like next to the cows where they were working at because they didn't have a place to eat. And I know here in Skagit, they're developing housing for H-2A workers in Burlington, but I'm not really sure how that's working. And I know some of the local farm workers are upset because we don't even have affordable housing here. Like there's been, during the pandemic, that has been highlighted that there's no affordable housing. We have community members living in a 3-bedroom apartment with like 7 to 10 family members that are like their aunts, their grandparents, their siblings, their parents. It's a multi-generational household, and they're upset that H-2A workers in a way are getting prioritized for the housings when there's already these workers that have been here for 20 plus years and can't find a place to live, or they can't afford because of the wages. Like Australia mentioned early, we also talked to community members that have worked for companies for over 25 years and they're still making minimum wage.
I would also to add on top of like Arely's comment, which is like, yeah, thank you for like, yeah, explaining like that local experience. And like the fact that Whatcom and Skagit County have low numbers of H-2A workers is due to the community organizing, you know, with the union and also C2C and other allies because of the conditions H-2A workers experience. While we might not have a high number here locally, we see that in parts of Yakima, Wenatchee, Central Washington, where that's being used as like just a common practice of labor because según there's like lack of domestic workers. But to answer Andres's question, H-2A visa workers do have access to healthcare on paper, and on paper they have access to housing. And I say paper because the reality is they do, but they don't, because like these workers, unfortunately, we'll see this, what will happen with the workers at Gebler's Farms, right? H-2A workers who got sick right, with COVID due to congregate housing. That's why we were pushing to have some really stringent, but also safety protocols that were common sense to protect workers and housing conditions where they're compact, right? The purpose of you as an H-2A employer, you just want to, support the code of making sure your housing is compliant, but it is a very, you work, you get up and you work, and that is it. It's very isolating. It's very isolated labor, and your access to healthcare, if you do get it, is through a medical system that's partnered with the employer. So if you want to speak up about a workplace injury or something that happened to you, it might not go noticed, or you may be discouraged from filing a labor and industries complaint. So that was a really good question. Thank you, Andres, for asking that, because that is intersectional with our work, because we see labor and immigration very, very connected, and H-2A workers, unfortunately, during this pandemic, were also hit very hard and resulted in the death of Earl Edwards and other farm workers at Gebler's Farms.
Thank you. Great. So yeah, we have about a couple minutes left, and so yeah, maybe we can start to close up. I would, Maribel and Angela, would you like to say our last words, maybe? Últimas palabras. Anything we want to say to close us out?
Are we still talking about the H2 workers?
Or anything you want. Yeah, if you
Anything?
anything
Okay.
at the end.
Las experiencias que a mí me han contado de lo que han pasado los trabajadores del campo que vienen contratados, como dicen ellos, como se llaman ellos, los contratados, han sido en maltrato, ¿verdad? En forma de maltrato. No han sido tratados muy bien. Conozco una persona que se accidentó, les avisó que se había accidentado y lo ignoraron. En vez de darle tratamiento, lo enviaron para México y lo marcaron como the black line, o sea, black sheet, o sea, ya no regresas porque eres problemático. Y esa persona hasta ahorita tiene problemas, o sea, médicos, y pues se quedó a su suerte, ¿verdad? ¿Qué puede hacer uno cuando algo así pasa y estas personas le platican lo que están pasando? ¿Cómo puede hacer uno para, bueno, ahorita ya sé que puedo contactar a Edgar, a Ramón, ¿verdad? Pero a veces ellos no les dan esa oportunidad de hablar con otras personas, los tienen aislados, sin que no pueden salir, hasta les traen la comida por tal de que no salgan y se comuniquen con nadie. O sea, es una cosa terrible, ¿no? Yo no podía creer que esto todavía en esta época está pasando, ¿verdad? Pero está sucediendo algo así.
Gracias. The experiences that I've seen in the fields, what I've witnessed, it has mostly been mistreatment in terms of, back to the question on H-2A workers. They are not treated well. They have not been treated well. I know a person that had an accident and he was ignored and not treated for that accident that he had. They instead marked him like the black sheep, or blacklisted, not allowed to return to work. He was seen as problematic. And that person till today is still experiencing issues because of this accident that he had. Sometimes workers can say, well, what can we do? I know I can contact Edgar or Ramon, but what happens with workers is that sometimes they don't get the chance to talk to others because their bosses intentionally isolate them, and they also even give them their food so that they don't have a reason to leave and step out and communicate with others. I couldn't believe, and I can't believe, right, that this is still happening in this current century, but it is.
It's something that we call now what's the word?
Modern slavery.
Modern slavery.
Thank you. Yeah, so yeah, I see we're out of time, or a couple minutes over, but yeah, we just want to thank all of our panelists. So yes, thank you, Australia, and Arlie, and
Maribel.
Yeah,
thank you to all of the organizations for taking time. I want to just briefly read some of the affirmations in the chat and folks are expressing gratitude. Kathy says, the moms and aunties have traditionally not been seen outside the home as the leaders, though we all know who was boss at home. So I'm so proud of these young, strong women who know very well how this work helps other workers and models justice for their daughters. I want to say that you are also modeling for your sons to celebrate the strong women in their lives, equal partners to make a better world for their children too. Thank you, Kathy. And Eirik says, thank you so much for this most galvanizing presentation, truly inspiring to learn about these struggles and successes under such trying circumstances. Gracias por estar aquí, dice Amanda. We're very grateful for your time and for the stories and for the invitations to support in this work.
Yeah, and then we have the follow-up workshops, as Edgar talked about, a just transition, talked about cooperatives. We have Rosalinda Guillen from C2C will be doing workshops with us on May 21st and 28th, and I put the link to that in the chat. It's on the WordPress site if you would like to attend. It's open to students. And yes, supporting the worker-owned cooperative farm, Tierra y Libertad, buying their berries, and we'll learn more about their work too later on in May with Rosalinda. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all. Muchas gracias por estar aquí.
Muchas gracias.